This story is based on true events. Early one morning in 1956, deep in the Ecuadorian rainforest, 5 men waited on a narrow sandbar beside a small yellow plane. For days they had listened to the forest, its silence, its warnings, its hints that something was approaching. They hoped the quiet meant trust, not danger. Then the tree line shifted. Figures emerged, Guarani warriors carrying long wooden spears. 4 months, the missionaries had offered gifts from the air, lowering baskets on ropes and calling friendly phrases in a language they had only recently learned, hoping kindness might cross a boundary built by generations of fear. Now the moment they had prepared for, prayed for, and wondered about was finally unfolding before them. What happened next lasted only minutes. Fear and confusion blurred intentions. When it was over, all 5 missionaries lay dead on the sand. Their guns remained unfired. The full truth of that moment could only ever belong to the people who lived through it. But this story does not end on a sandbar. It begins again with the woman who heard the news, Elisabeth Elliot, holding her infant daughter, and making a decision no one expected, to walk toward the very people who had taken her husband's life. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in something infinitely more difficult, a willingness to understand. Elisabeth and her husband Jim had shared the belief that love could cross even the hardest boundaries. They married in 1953 and worked among indigenous communities in Ecuador, preparing for years to approach the Guarani, a people whose encounters with outsiders had often ended in tragedy. Jim once wrote in his journal, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." After his death, Elisabeth would return to that line many times, not as prophecy, but as a reminder of the clarity with which he lived. Through the help of Deuma, a Guarani woman who had lived outside her community, and the ongoing efforts of missionary Rachel Saint, Elisabeth received an invitation from Guarani women who were cautiously open to contact. Despite warnings, despite grief that had barely taken shape, she chose to go. With her young daughter Valerie, she traveled for days by canoe through winding rivers, on foot beneath the dense canopy, into the world her husband had once approached with hope. When she arrived, the Guarani women greeted her with curiosity. They touched her hair, examined her clothing, and watched Valerie with quiet wonder. Words were few, but gestures carried meaning. Slowly, through shared work and patient learning, Elisabeth began to understand their rhythms, how they gathered food, cared for their families, treated wounds, and protected their community. She also saw how violence had shaped their lives for generations. A cycle of fear and retaliation passed down like a survival tool. Days became weeks and trust began to form. Children played together. Women shared food and stories through expression and movement. Some of the men, initially distant, eventually approached as well. The details belonged to them, but many accounts suggest that familiarity, not force, softened the distance between the two worlds. Elisabeth never described forgiveness as sudden. She called it a daily choice, a decision not to let grief define the future. Time deepened the relationships. Patterns of violence within the Guarani community began to shift as well. Influenced by Elisabeth's presence, Rachel Saint's continued work, and Guarani leaders who were seeking a different way forward. Trust, built slowly, began reshaping the community from within. In the years that followed, some Guarani who had once lived in cycles of retaliation became advocates for peace, even traveling abroad to speak about reconciliation and change. Their voices carried a perspective shaped by loss, transformation, and the possibility of new beginnings. Elisabeth eventually left the rainforest, remarried, and spent decades writing about grief, courage, and faith. Until her death in 2015, she reminded the world that forgiveness is not the end of a story. It is the start of a different one. Years later, photographs would show members of the Waorani community standing beside the grown children of the missionaries, smiling, their arms resting gently around one another. If someone saw the picture without knowing the history, they might think they were family. And in many ways they were. Some stories begin after everything has been taken away. This one began on a sandbar and continued with a woman who refused to let fear have the final word. It became not a tale of enemies and heroes, but a story of understanding, fragile at first and then slowly real. The rest is what we choose to make of it.